Okay, so now we will have our Executive Director, Anika Goss, kick us off and share a little bit about our organization and and the work that we do.
Hi, everyone. I want to thank you so much I'm sorry about the background noise here. There's someone who's doing a lot of construction across the hall from where I live. So, but I just want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy week, even as we are all still, I think for the most part, working from home or working from wherever you are in social distance. This really should have been an opportunity. This stakeholder meeting was an opportunity for us all to come together to talk. But I really appreciate your patience as we try to Zoom our way through the rest of this lockdown so that we can get to continue some of the work. So some of you who don't know me, I'm Anika Goss. I'm the Executive Director at Detroit Future City. Detroit Future City is a think and do tank based in Detroit that came out of the original Detroit Strategic Framework, which is on the slide. That was that took place in 2000, that was completed in 2012 as the 50-year long-term economic development and land use vision for Detroit. Since then, Detroit Future City has opened as a standalone nonprofit on West Grand Boulevard, where our offices were. Now we live in the internet on Zoom. For the most part, but if you could go to the next slide, Sema, we in 2017 reorganized ourselves as a nonprofit to focus on three primary areas. The first is land use and sustainability, where we focus on open space and vacant lot reclamation in Detroit. As well as green stormwater infrastructure work in Detroit. Hey, Tammy, good to see you too, girl. So good to see everybody, actually. We also focus on community and economic development, where we primarily focus on single-family rental through the Housing Compact. We focus on vacant industrial, and the adaptive reuse of vacant industrial as an economic development strategy, and small business and entrepreneurship growth in Detroit at the neighborhood level. And then we had a third area that was publications and research, and that was really the area where we were engaging Detroit through data and information, so that Detroiters were helping everyone to understand, ourselves understand, and others understand how Detroit was growing and changing in the context of the framework, but also issues that were really relevant to them. And a few of our publications that came out were 139 Square Miles, and the African American Middle Class report, but also smaller reports that have led to other initiatives like our single family housing report and our report on vacant industrial. But it was this work around our publications and research that really sort of led us to the work in the center. And there were a couple of data points that I wanted just to share with you quickly. One in particular was when we realized that in 2017, which was just a few years ago, that 75% of Detroiters were making $50,000 or less. And only 14% of Detroiters had an associate's degree or higher. And so if we were really going to be intentional about how to create a long-term 50-year economic future for Detroit, we had to really consider what were the intentional equity barriers, the inequities that kept us from really achieving Detroit's own success. So we organized the Center for Equity Engagement and Research and moved some people over. Shari Williams and Edward Lynch moved over from other parts of DFC and hired Ashley Clark, who's as the director, and then with other support from SEMA and other SEMA, who's an AmeriCorps member, and then other interns. We really began to build the capacity and breadth of what it means to create an equitable future for Detroit. And so in doing that, one of the things that we really felt was most important about this was that even though DFC could come up with all of the data and the research to be able to defend an equity strategy for Detroit that everyone, you know, would probably agree with, what was most important was that as many people as possible contributed to what that equity future looked like, what that equity definition looked like, what those indicators looked like that we would be measuring over the long term, and that as we begin to develop an advisory going forward that would help us look into the future in terms of how this is measured, that table was also inclusive. That even that table included senior leadership from block clubs to the CEO level. And so you're gonna hear all about that process today, but I just really wanna thank you for joining us and being a part of this, or the very beginning stages of what we believe is a really, really important moment in time for Detroit, not only for the country as well, but for us to be able to see ourselves as a place, Detroit as a place that will lead the country and how you can thrive no matter where you are on the economic spectrum and how you contribute. You can do that here in Detroit. And so I don't want to take up too much time. You guys have a lot of work to do over the next couple hours. And I just really want to tell you how grateful I am for your contribution to this. So thank you again. And I think I'm turning it over to Ashley. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Anika. I'm very grateful to you for that wonderful introduction. And it's so wonderful to meet all of you who are joining us on this call today. So welcome everyone. I am Ashley Williams Clark. I'm the new director of the newly formed Center on Equity Engagement and Research here at DFC. As Anika mentioned, the center is a new division of DFC that builds upon and expands upon DFC's guiding principles of equity and engagement. And the center is really focused on building an understanding of how to improve economic equity in Detroit. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that though we are doing this work, we're not the first to be able to move down this path. And there's been so much work currently in this community, which is why we are so grateful that all of you are part of this conversation and contributing to this work. The center will be leveraging DFC's research and convening capacity to focus in on economic equity and to mobilize change. So how are we going to do this? What does that look like? So we will influence and we will engage corporations, investors, policymakers, and civic leaders to promote equity. We'll also be working to establish a common definition of equity to be shared among stakeholders and decision makers. We're aware that equity is a term that has many different meanings to many different people. It also may mean something completely different or unique in the Detroit context, which is why it's so important to us to take this opportunity to engage with all of you and to help inform the creation of this shared definition of economic equity in the Detroit region. So through this, the change we want to see. We want to support change. We want to help bridge the gap between decision makers and community. We want to empower residents with data and research. to help them understand the change happening, to understand the information used to make those decisions, and to be able to use the data themselves to be change makers. We all will play a role in advancing economic equity in Detroit, and we're excited to be on this journey together. So I will breeze through the next slide since Anika already did a great job of introducing our team. You'll see them throughout the conversation today and in your breakout sessions. Also joining us today, we will have facilitators. We'll have Amy Bloom from the Center for the Study of Citizenship at Wayne State University. We'll have Nikita Buckoy from City Connect Detroit, and we'll also have Kelly Carey joining us. So now for the agenda. We have a couple goals for the meeting that we'll go through. We'll provide some background on the Indicators Project. We'll talk a little bit about where we've been so we can understand where we want to go. So what was the state of economic equity in Detroit and the region? And we say was because we understand that COVID has really impacted things. We'll also talk about how we're approaching defining economic equity, and then we'll open it up for discussion with all of you to help inform that definition and inform our indicators work. So the goals for today. First, we'd like to make sure that we present to you information about the Economic Indicators Project so you have a good understanding of the work that we're planning to do. We'd like to get your input on the definition of economic equity and the categories for those indicators. Then let's talk about developing economic equity. So as we approach developing these indicators, there are a couple key things that we think are really important to accomplish in this process. So first, making sure that we're creating a shared definition of economic equity for the city and the region, something we can engage around, something we can all mobilize around. From that, we want to make sure that we can use that definition to identify and track our progress toward economic equity in the region using a set of indicators that we develop. In order to make sure we are impacting things, we have to make sure we have an understanding of whether we are actually accomplishing and moving that needle forward. These indicators will help us do that, along with combining data and research. And lastly, they'll move us towards galvanizing cross-sector leaders and residents to move toward economic equity. So how are we engaging to develop these indicators? We are engaging individuals and groups that have a vested interest in Detroit and groups that have the power to advance equitable policies and practices. You all represent our stakeholder group. We are engaging with stakeholders over this past week and this current week to get your input on definitions. You represent a broad range of nonprofit organizations, public sector, private sector, and just community members who are invested in Detroit. We have additional community members who we're engaging with. We also have a steering committee that we will be working with that will represent leadership from community-based organizations all the way up to foundations and corporations. And lastly, we'll be doing engagement on social media as well. Our goal is that for those who want to have input in this process, that we create a space for their voice to be heard and engaged in this process. So what does this process actually look like? Early in 2020, we hosted our first ever equity forum. We had over 300 people participate, and it was a phenomenal event. It's where we really embarked on our work formally around economic equity. And it was through that event that we established this stakeholder group. And people signed up to participate, and we have continued to invite people to participate as a stakeholder and to be engaged. Throughout spring 2020, we've been working to establish baseline data. We are continuing to do research and framing and planning. We released a special report on COVID that we would encourage you all to check out that talks really about some of the social determinants of health and the inequities that have shown up through COVID. We also released a report focused on entrepreneurship in Detroit in collaboration with NEI. And we've also been doing some work around framing and planning. In summer 2020, that's where we are right now. We are working on establishing this shared definition of equity. We are identifying high-level indicators, and from there, that will help us identify some additional baseline data. Moving into fall 2020, we'll be finalizing our indicators, cultivating some shared language, and making sure we're moving in alignment. And then in winter 2020, towards early 2021, we'll be releasing the indicators report, which might be a physical report, it might be a web-based report. We're still determining what that looks like. And we're going to use that information to empower all of you and for us to help drive action and to continue to convene and align our work towards advancing economic equity in our region. But key thing I want to point out in all of this is that there are community engagement points all along the way. So on this next slide, you'll see that we've identified that there's some key moments where we want to make sure that we get your input as stakeholders, as steering committee members, community members. We'll be having a variety of ways in which we engage folks to make sure that we're getting that community input as we move forward in our process. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shari, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what the state of economic equity in Detroit and the region is or was prior to COVID. I think it's really important that as we create this vision for a future, we have to understand where we are and where we want to be before we can take a deeper step into how we're going to get there. So Shari is going to share some of our initial findings about that.
Thanks, Ashley. So what is the state of economic equity in Detroit and the region? Our team took a look at a few data points, and we definitely want to share that with you today to set some context regarding the state of economic equity in the region. So first, we took a look at 4 periods of growth over the last 20 years. The punctuated local decline shows that moment in Detroit and the region where we witnessed decline in jobs while the economy nationwide saw growth as a whole. This long period of decline in Detroit and the region was a major contributing factor to the continued decline in the city and the region throughout the Great Recession. Economic equity in Detroit and the region has 2 main components that we wanted to pull out. One is racial and the other is spatial. These issues are consistent over the last 20 years. You can see here with unemployment where there were higher rates of unemployment for African Americans in both Detroit and the region. And that reality was also higher if you lived in Detroit, no matter what your race is. The same can be seen here as we look at the average median household income by race, where you can see in both periods of time, income levels are lower for Detroiters as a whole. But in the region, there are also disparities for both African Americans and Hispanic and Latinos. And when we look at the share of bachelor's degree or higher, we can see that since 2000, the education attainment for residents has generally increased throughout the region. However, driven by significant increases in the share of white Detroiters with a bachelor's degree or higher, that gap between white and African American educational attainment has grown significantly in Detroit. So again, just to remind you all, we're here today to build that collective consensus on the definition of economic equity. And we want to take a moment to talk a little bit with you all around how we're kind of shaping our thinking around economic equity at Detroit Future City, and kind of start to set some context and some baseline for a conversation with you all in just a few moments. So we're fully aware that there are a plethora of terms that are used in our ecosystem that are adjacent to the term equity. And this list here is not exhaustive of all of those terms, which actually amplifies the need for us to have this discussion with you today and cultivate some common language. We also recognize that there's currently unequal access to opportunities in society. And we consider these times during the beginnings of our work to even start to frame our definition, in which you'll see shortly. Many of us know that there are a lot of things taking place, and things like equality, which is the unequal distribution of tools and assistance across the board, doesn't really meet the mark. And we also recognize that we really want to get to a place where we see customized tools and opportunities created to fix systemic barriers and offer equal access to tools and opportunities no matter who you are. And when we think about economic equity, we also want to lift up to you all that we know that in reaching economic equity, there's a touch on various systems and elements that feed into economic equity. When we look at these inequities in our society, many times we also recognize that there are other things that play a role in that, which we even highlighted in our data a moment ago. Some things like your racial identity and your gender identity, where you live, and even your social and sexual orientation. So getting to a definition, our team looked at all of this information and also a few more details to really get to a point of identifying what our goals are for a definition, and also through what those elements need to include in our definition. Our goals are to ensure that however we define economic equity, it should be clear, it should provide a clear understanding of what economic equity is, and be cultivated in the context of Detroit and the region. We also believe that it should include these elements as well. We want to make sure that we're outlining who matters most, what processes and strategies need to be used, where they need to be used, and also how long, what is that time frame that we need to be considering. So we also looked at definitions across the country at other organizations doing really great work. And these were just a couple of definitions that we'd like to lift up. We felt like they really resonated with where we're trying to go with our definition, with D5 Coalition and the Certain Foundation. And we also listened to you, our stakeholders, during our equity forum in January, which many of you participated in. And we heard things like leveling the playing field, building stronger connections to involve diverse and vulnerable voices to develop solutions, sharing resources across systems and sectors, eliminating racism, and many other things when we had our table talks during that event. So we took all that information, put it together, had several conversations as a team internally, and we got ourselves to this draft definition, which says all residents of Detroit and the metro region, regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, or any other human factor, have access to a broad range of opportunities and resources that promote their ability to meet their basic everyday needs, as well as reach their full potential and prosper. And when we kind of think about those elements that I introduced a moment ago, we highlighted how we got to that definition. So this definition gets us to what, who, how, and where.
We are going to ask each group to report out and let us know how the conversations went during the breakout session. So group one, do you have a volunteer that has agreed to share with the larger group on what was discussed in your group and what some highlights might have been?
We do.
Oh, Nikita,
Craig, are you there? Yep.
Okay, we're group one. Okay.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Craig Notte. Thank you for this opportunity. Our group, with many diverse viewpoints, which was appreciated, came to believe that the definition alludes more to equality with an emphasis on access. That means access to knowledge, access to resources, access to health, access to value. We think the definition should touch on land use in the sense that accessing the underlying value of land that many individuals in the city owns is key to an economic future. We also discussed employment opportunity and equity as critical, entrepreneurship, and the idea of constructing a foundation to access. We think the definition should address historic inequality with an acknowledgement that process is key to getting to these success points. Thank you.
Thank you. It's amazing. So group two, which was Amy's group, do you have a volunteer that would like to share?
Well, I voluntold Denise, so.
Yeah, I've been voluntold. My name is Denise Smith, and
Hi, Denise.
I'm going to begin the share, but ask my group also to lean in where they feel that I missed some things, because we had a very robust conversation and a lot of ideas, and I don't think we were as concise with what was relayed in the previous group, but I can say that overall, that there, in terms of this definition and the realization of it, there are two linchpins, one being perception, both internal, the city and its residents, and external, how others see us and perceive Detroit in being, and then real capacity, right? Are we elevating the growth, economic and otherwise, of our individual residents? And for us, residents begins very early. Of course, I'm in that group. Of course, it does. So we're talking about at birth, and looking at capacity and access to better outcomes in health and education, all the way up to our most senior residents. And some of the systemic barriers that we elevated were around housing, which then makes transportation challenging. But education and hiring practices, policies, wage and wage parity, some generational wealth, geography, as well as representation of ethnicities across, and even gender across all of our different fields and means. So I'm gonna leave it to the rest of my group if they wanna add to that, because there was a lot compressed into the time that we had together.
I'm going to add one piece that came out at the end. The definition doesn't speak to going after removing barriers. And it's all about creating new opportunities. But if we're going to deal with it systemically, there's probably some breakdowns that we need to break down some things as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's an amazing conversation, sounds like. So group 3, we have Kelly. And actually, I was in that room, so I know who our volunteer is, and it would be Olga. Would you like to share with the rest of the participants today on how our discussion went?
Sure. So we I think probably had a very similar conversation to some of the other groups. And I think just talked about ways to make the definition even a little bit more inclusive. We noticed that age and ability were specifically missing from the definition of economic equity. We talked a little bit more. We had a pretty robust conversation around how would we define and measure success, both around housing, income, poverty rates, the experience of children, kind of workforce attainment, those kinds of things. We talked a lot about, I think, we in terms of the kind of systemic barriers to economic equity, we had I think it felt pretty overwhelming when we raised it up, but like many of the other groups, talked a lot about just the the lack of support in our educational systems. And I think a lot of our conversation was about education, housing, transit. So, entrepreneurship, the supports around entrepreneurship. So I think unless there's anybody else who would like to chime in, I was also voluntold at the end and didn't do a great job taking notes. So if anything else my group would like to chime in, I would welcome it.
I think you did a great job.
Digital access was the other thing.
Yes.
And how critical that is for economic equity going forward.
Yes. Thanks, Olga. Great job. All right, great job, everyone. This was a really intense conversation, I think, because this is it's a big problem. It's a big issue. And so I just want to thank you all again for your time today. We have one more thing that we'd like to ask from you before we close out for the day, and that is to take part in a quick, very, very quick survey. And so there should be a link in the chat that Sema has shared with you to join this Mentimeter and answer a quick question, which is, what are the top 3 focus areas to measure economic equity in Detroit? And we'll share those responses as they come in If for some reason you are having a challenge with getting to that link, feel free to drop your response into the chat box and we'll be sure to capture it for you and place it in Mentimeter for you. So we have a few responses come in. There's also one in the chat box, which I will ask Madeline if you could actually plop that into the Mentimeter. That would be very helpful. Okay, we're going to take just a few more seconds to pull in responses, but let's see what's rising to the top. We have housing, quite a bit, quite a few of you are saying housing.
Sorry, there's a call from the chat.
Oh, are there? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay. So from the DFC team, Madeline, can you confirm that you're able to capture these
Yes,
responses in the chat?
I'm plopping them in right now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay. More efficient land use and access to education. I do see transit quite a bit as well. Let's take maybe another 30 to 45 seconds, a little less than a minute to respond to this, and then we'll go ahead and begin our closeout. And if for some reason you're still thinking, that link will be made available to you for a little while longer, so feel free to take your time. However, for the sake of time, I will go ahead and invite Ashley to close us out. And again, I just want to thank you all for your time and for attending. And it's so good to see many of you that I do know and I haven't had a chance to see in a long time. It's good to see your faces and your names on the screen. Ashley.
Great, thank you, Shari. And I was trying to echo Shari's sentiments of thank you so much for such a thoughtful discussion today. I had the opportunity to hop in a couple of the rooms, just kind of listen to the conversations that were taking place. And I was so amazed by the really thoughtful questions you were asking and the ways you were pushing us as we approach this definition and our work around economic equity. So we want to continue to engage with all of you. As far as our next steps, so thinking back to that timeline I presented of what our work will look like over the next couple months, over the rest of the summer, we're going to engage next with that steering committee that I mentioned. Then we'll go back and we'll take all the input from the stakeholders, which is you, with the steering committee. We also have a youth group that we are going to be getting feedback from. And we're going to revise and finalize that definition of economic equity. Then we'll continue to connect with the community and circle that back around. Then in fall 2020, we'll be meeting with stakeholders. All of you, again, keep an eye out for communication from us regarding that. And we'll re-engage that steering committee. And then we'll move forward in determining the indicators to track economic equity. And then finalizing up in winter 2020, early 2021, as I mentioned, we'll think through how we best present all of this information around indicators and the context surrounding them in some form of an indicators report, and then make sure we're continuing to do engagement and alignment around that. So one thing that I would ask of all of you is that please continue to feel like you can share with us. If you close out today and you say, oh man, there's something I really wish I would have shared, or oh wow, I really know somebody who would have some valuable insights that was not able to participate in one of these sessions, we've set up something called a Submittable that allows you to send in a short video, audio, or written response to the questions that we've talked about today. Someone's put the link in the chat box as well. I'd encourage you, if you have anything you want to share, if you know somebody who might want to share or provide their input, please go ahead and use that link. And if that's not what works best, feel free to also email us. We're available. We want to hear your thoughts and input in this process. So with that, thank you all so much. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you and sharing out how your thoughts have been reflected in that final definition. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and continue to do the work that all of you are doing to advance economic equity.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.